You don't get to want her now, just because someone else finally does. The words hadn't been spoken yet, but somehow, standing there in the soft amber glow of a Manhattan restaurant, Adrian Vale felt them land before they ever left her lips, sharp and inevitable, like a truth he had been avoiding for years. The quiet hum of conversation and the faint clink of silverware blurred into the background as his eyes locked onto one thing: Chloe Bennet, seated by the window, her silhouette framed by the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass. She was laughing. Not the polite, measured smile she wore in the office, not the quiet nod she gave during meetings, but a real laugh, warm, unguarded, effortless. And it wasn't for him. Adrian didn't move. He stood just inside the entrance, coat still draped over his arm, as if stepping any closer might shatter something he didn't yet understand. For 5 years, Chloe had been a constant in his life. Every morning, precisely at 8 a.m., there was coffee on his desk, black, no sugar. His schedule ran like a machine because she made it that way. Flights booked before he asked, meetings anticipated before they were requested, problems solved before they reached him. She was efficient. Reliable. Invisible. That was the word he had never said out loud but had lived by without question. Invisible. Until now. The man across from her leaned in slightly, saying something that made her shake her head, her fingers brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear in a way Adrian had never noticed before. The gesture was small, almost nothing, but it felt like a crack forming somewhere deep in his chest. Who is he? The thought came uninvited, unwelcome, immediate. Adrian's jaw tightened. He should leave. There was no reason for him to be here, no scheduled dinner, no business obligation. This was just another restaurant in a city full of them, and Chloe Bennet was just an employee having dinner with someone who clearly wasn't him. So why couldn't he walk away? A memory flickered, her standing in his office late one evening, holding a folder, waiting while he finished a call that ran 15 minutes too long. She hadn't complained. She never did. Another one, her quietly placing a jacket over his shoulders after he had dozed off on the couch during a long night of work. He had woken up alone, the jacket gone, the moment forgotten. Or maybe ignored. Adrian exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the edge of the chair beside him. He had never asked about her life. Not once. Not where she went after work, not who she spent her time with, not what made her laugh like that. Because it had never mattered. Until it did. Chloe reached for her glass, her smile softening as she listened, and something inside Adrian shifted, subtle but undeniable. This wasn't about curiosity. It wasn't about control. It was something far more dangerous. For the first time in years, Adrian Vale felt like he was losing something he didn't even realize he had. And the worst part was, he had no idea when it started slipping away. The next morning, the city moved like nothing had changed, but Adrian Vale felt the difference the moment he stepped into his office. Everything was exactly where it should be. The blinds were half open, letting in just enough sunlight to cut across the polished floor. His desk was cleared, aligned, efficient. And there it was, waiting for him at precisely 8 o'clock, a cup of black coffee placed exactly 2 inches from the edge, no sugar, no cream. Chloe Bennet was already at her desk, fingers moving quickly across her keyboard, her posture perfect, her expression calm. If anyone else had seen her, they would have thought nothing had changed. But Adrian noticed. He noticed the way she did not look up immediately when he walked in. For 5 years she had always greeted him within seconds, a soft but steady, "Good morning, Mr. Vale," her voice grounded, attentive. Today, there was a pause. A fraction of a second, maybe less. Then she glanced up, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, Adrian." It was subtle, but it landed harder than it should have. She never called him by his first name. Not unless they were alone. Not unless he had asked her to, and even then, she used it carefully, like it did not quite belong to her. He set his coat down slowly, his mind catching on that detail longer than it should have. "Good morning, Chloe," he replied, his tone even, controlled, practiced. He moved toward his desk, picking up the coffee, taking a sip. It was perfect, as always. Nothing had changed. So why did it feel like everything had? He glanced at her again, but she was already focused back on her screen, scrolling through his schedule. "You have a 9:30 board call," she said, her voice steady, professional. 11 o'clock investor briefing. Lunch has been scheduled at 1:15 with Rothman Group. And at 6, the charity gala. Her words were precise, efficient, exactly what he needed. Exactly what she had always given him. But something was missing. Or maybe something was no longer being given. Last night lingered in his mind uninvited. The way she laughed. The way she leaned forward, fully present with someone who was not him. Adrian set the coffee down a little harder than intended, the sound sharp against the quiet office. Chloe paused for just a moment, her fingers hovering above the keyboard before continuing. He noticed that too. He noticed everything now. Who was he? The question slipped out before he could stop it. Chloe blinked, looking up, clearly caught off guard. "I am sorry?" "The man from last night," Adrian clarified, his tone still calm, but tighter now, like something just beneath the surface was beginning to press forward. "I saw you at the restaurant." There was a brief silence. Not uncomfortable, not awkward. Just different. Chloe leaned back slightly in her chair, studying him in a way she never had before. His gaze did not waver. "That was Daniel," she said finally, her voice measured, neutral. "He is someone I have been spending time with." The words were simple. Too simple. But they echoed louder than they should have. Spending time. Adrian nodded once, as if that explanation was enough, as if it did not matter. "Of course," he said, turning back toward his desk, picking up a file he did not actually need to read. "That is good." He meant it to sound dismissive. Casual. Unaffected. But there was a slight delay before the words came out, a barely noticeable hesitation that did not go unnoticed by Chloe. She watched him for a second longer, then returned to her work, but something had shifted between them, something neither of them could pretend was not there anymore. For the first time in 5 years, the space between them felt real. And Adrian was starting to understand that it was not just distance. It was absence. By the time the charity gala arrived that evening, the city had shifted into something quieter, more polished, the kind of night where black cars lined the curb and every detail was curated to impress. Adrian adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit as he stepped out onto the marble entrance, his expression composed, unreadable, exactly as the world expected it to be. Inside, the ballroom glowed under chandeliers, conversations blending into a smooth hum of influence and ambition. This was his world. Controlled. Predictable. Structured. And yet, the moment he stepped inside, his eyes moved without permission, scanning the room with a focus that had nothing to do with business. He told himself it was habit. Awareness. Control. But he knew better. He was looking for her. Chloe arrived 20 minutes later. Adrian noticed immediately, even before she fully stepped into the light. She wore a simple navy dress, nothing extravagant, nothing designed to draw attention, and yet it did. Or maybe it was just him. She moved with quiet confidence, greeting colleagues with polite smiles, her posture relaxed in a way he had never seen during office hours. And then he saw him. Daniel. Standing beside her, one hand resting lightly at the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd with an ease that felt far too familiar. Adrian's jaw tightened, the movement subtle but deliberate. He picked up a glass of water from a passing tray, his fingers wrapping around it just a little too firmly. He had no reason to feel this. No right. Chloe Bennett was not his responsibility outside of work. She was not his to question, not his to notice, not his to lose. And yet, the thought pressed in anyway, unwelcome and persistent. Lose. The word did not belong in his vocabulary. Not in business. Not in life. Adrian Vale did not lose things. He replaced them. He moved forward. He stayed ahead. That was how he had built everything he had. But standing there, watching Chloe laugh softly at something Daniel said. That certainty felt unstable. A group of investors approached, pulling Adrian into conversation, but his responses were automatic, precise, empty of real attention. He nodded at the right moments, spoke when required, but his focus drifted back again and again, pulled by something he could not quite control. Eventually, their paths crossed. It was inevitable in a room like this. Chloe turned, nearly stepping into him, her expression shifting slightly when she realized how close they were. "Adrian," she said, her tone polite, measured, but not distant. "Just different." Adrian's gaze moved briefly to Daniel, then back to her. "You came," he said, as if that was the most relevant thing to acknowledge. "Of course," she replied, offering a small smile. "You asked me to coordinate half of this event. I was not going to miss it." The reminder was gentle, but it landed with more weight than expected. He had asked. She had delivered. Just like always. Adrian nodded once, then glanced again at Daniel. "And this is?" Daniel stepped forward slightly, extending a hand with calm confidence. "Daniel Reed. It is nice to finally meet you. Chloe has told me a lot about you." Adrian hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking his hand. His grip was firm, controlled, but there was a tension beneath it that he could not fully hide. "Has she?" Adrian replied, his tone smooth, but there was an edge now, something sharper than before. Chloe noticed. She always noticed. Daniel smiled easily, unaware or perhaps unconcerned. "Only good things," he said. Adrian's gaze flickered back to Chloe, searching, questioning, something unspoken building behind his eyes. And for the first time, she did not immediately fill the silence for him. She simply looked back, steady, calm, no longer reaching to smooth over the space between them. And in that moment, surrounded by hundreds of people, Adrian realized something he had never felt before. He was not in control of this room. Not anymore. The applause rose and fell in smooth waves as the program continued, but Adrian barely registered a single word spoken on that stage, his attention tethered to a quiet gravity he could not escape, the kind that pulled without permission and held without explanation, and every time Chloe shifted even slightly across the room, he felt it like a signal he had never learned how to ignore, until now, until this moment forced him to realize just how aware he had always been without admitting it. And when Daniel leaned in again to say something that made her smile, Adrian's composure tightened just enough to be felt but not seen, the glass in his hand resting untouched as condensation gathered along its surface, a small detail he would normally notice and correct, but tonight he let it sit, because control was slipping in ways he could not recalibrate, and when one of the board members beside him asked a question, Adrian responded a second too late, his voice measured but distant, earning a brief, curious glance that he did not acknowledge, because for the first time, the room was no longer his priority, and that realization alone unsettled him more than anything else could have, because it meant something had shifted internally, something he could not negotiate, not manage, not dismiss, and that was unfamiliar territory for a man who built his entire life on precision, and then it happened, subtle, almost insignificant to anyone else. Chloe excused herself from Daniel's side and moved toward the quieter edge of the ballroom, near the tall windows where the city stretched out in soft lines of light, and Adrian saw the moment before it happened, before he even understood his own decision, his body already moving before logic could intervene, each step deliberate yet driven by something far less controlled, until he reached her just as she turned slightly, surprised but not startled, as if she had sensed him approaching even before he arrived. "Adrian," she said, her voice calm, not guarded, not distant, just steady, and that steadiness unsettled him more than any confrontation would have, because she was no longer adjusting herself around him, no longer anticipating his needs or filling the silence he created. She simply stood there, present, grounded in herself, and he realized in that instant that he had mistaken her consistency for permanence, and that had been his first mistake. "You left the main floor," he said, his tone neutral but carrying an undercurrent he could not quite mask. "Needed some air," she replied softly, glancing toward the window. "It is quieter here." Adrian nodded once, but he did not leave. He did not step back into the structured world that suddenly felt less certain. Instead, he remained, standing just close enough to feel the shift in distance that had once been invisible but now felt deliberate, calculated, real, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching but not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, until Adrian broke it. "You seem different." The words came out slower than intended, more exposed than he would have allowed in any other setting. Chloe tilted her head slightly, studying him with a quiet curiosity that did not seek approval. "I am not," she said gently. "I am just not trying so hard anymore." The simplicity of it struck deeper than any accusation could have. Adrian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Trying so hard," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the phrase. Chloe nodded, her gaze steady. "I used to make sure everything around you was easy, seamless, like nothing ever went wrong, and you never had to notice the effort behind it." She paused briefly, not to gather courage, but to choose clarity. But that was never sustainable. Adrian exhaled slowly, the truth in her words pressing against something he had kept carefully contained for years, and in that moment, he saw it, not just her standing in front of him, but every version of her he had overlooked, every quiet gesture, every unspoken effort, every moment she had been there without asking to be seen, and now that she had stopped, now that she had stepped back, the absence was impossible to ignore. "Daniel is a good man," Chloe added after a brief pause, not defensive, not provocative, just honest. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly, his response immediate but controlled. "I am sure he is." But the words felt hollow even as he said them, because for the first time, Adrian Vale was not evaluating a situation from a place of authority. He was standing in it, uncertain, unprepared, and quietly realizing that the one thing he had always assumed would remain unchanged had already begun to move on without him. The silence between them did not break immediately, but something inside it shifted, like a quiet realization settling into place where denial used to be, and Adrian found himself searching for something to say that did not sound like a command, something that did not come from habit or authority, but that was unfamiliar ground, and for a moment, he simply stood there, looking at her in a way he had never allowed himself to before, not as an extension of his world, not as a system that functioned flawlessly around him, but as a person who had her own gravity, her own direction, her own life that no longer revolved around his, and that realization landed heavier than any negotiation he had ever faced. "You never said anything," he said finally, the words quieter than expected, almost careful. Chloe's expression softened just slightly, not in pity, but in understanding. "I did," she replied gently, "just not in ways you were listening for." Adrian's brow tightened almost imperceptibly, replaying moments that had once seemed insignificant, a question asked at the wrong time, a pause that he filled with work instead of attention, a look he never returned because he was already thinking 3 steps ahead, and now those fragments began to align into something clearer, something he could not dismiss as coincidence. "I thought you were fine," he admitted, the word sounding insufficient even as it left his mouth. Chloe let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite disappointment, just acknowledgement. "I was efficient," she corrected softly. "There is a difference." The distinction was simple, but it cut through years of assumption with quiet precision. Adrian looked away briefly, his gaze drifting toward the city beyond the glass, the lights stretching endlessly, each one representing something built, something controlled, something he understood, but none of it prepared him for this moment, for the realization that the one thing he had never tried to understand was standing right in front of him, and now it might be too late. Behind them, the music shifted slightly, a softer tone signaling a transition in the evening's program, but neither of them moved, because this moment, small as it seemed, held more weight than anything happening on that stage. "Daniel is patient," Chloe continued after a brief pause, her voice steady. "He listens." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly again, not in anger, but in recognition, because those were qualities he had never considered necessary in his world, not when results spoke louder than words, not when efficiency was the measure of value, and yet here they were, the very things he had overlooked now defining the space he could no longer reach. "I could change that," Adrian said before he could stop himself, the words immediate, instinctive, and for the first time, not calculated. Chloe looked at him then, really looked at him, as if weighing the sincerity behind the statement rather than the authority it carried. Could you? She asked softly, not challenging, not dismissive, just honest. Adrian held her gaze, and for a brief second, the confidence that had built his entire empire wavered, because this was not a deal he could negotiate, not a strategy he could execute. This required something else, something he had never practiced. I do not know, he admitted, the honesty surprising even himself. Chloe nodded slowly, as if that answer meant more than certainty ever could, and in that moment, something shifted again, not in the room, not in the crowd behind them, but between them, a fragile space opening where something real could exist. But it was not his to claim, not anymore, not without choice, and that was the difference he was only beginning to understand. Daniel stepped closer then, his presence calm, unthreatening, but undeniable. Everything okay? He asked, his tone respectful but grounded in a familiarity Adrian could not ignore. Chloe turned slightly toward him, her posture relaxed in a way Adrian had never seen directed at him. Yes, she said softly, everything is fine. Adrian nodded once, stepping back just enough to acknowledge the shift without resisting it, because for the first time, he understood that control was no longer the point, and as he walked away, rejoining the structured world that suddenly felt less certain, one thought remained, steady and unavoidable. She had not changed, she had simply stopped waiting. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polished conversations and carefully measured exchanges, but Adrian felt none of the usual clarity that came with navigating rooms like this. Instead, everything seemed slightly out of focus, like he was present but not fully anchored, and when the final speech concluded and guests began to disperse into smaller circles of conversation, he stepped away from the center of it all without drawing attention, moving toward the quieter corridor that led to the private offices upstairs, the familiar silence there offering something the ballroom no longer could control, or at least the illusion of it. He loosened his tie slightly as he walked, something he rarely did in public, and paused near the glass wall overlooking the city, his reflection staring back at him with a calm that felt practiced rather than real, because for the first time in years, Adrian Vale did not feel certain. Not about the room, not about the people in it, and certainly not about the one person who had always been within reach without ever being claimed. He let out a slow breath, his mind replaying the conversation with Chloe in fragments, her words simple but precise, cutting through years of assumption with quiet clarity. I was efficient, there is a difference. The sentence echoed again, sharper now, because he could no longer ignore what it implied, that he had built something powerful, something respected, something that functioned flawlessly, but in doing so, he had overlooked the difference between what worked and what mattered, and Chloe had been both, until she chose to stop being one of them. A soft knock at the door behind him broke the silence, controlled, deliberate, familiar. Come in, Adrian said without turning. The door opened quietly, and he did not need to look to know who it was. Chloe stepped inside, closing the door behind her with the same careful precision she had used for years. I wanted to confirm tomorrow's schedule before I leave, she said, her tone professional, steady, as if the conversation from earlier had been filed away and replaced with routine. Adrian turned slowly, studying her for a moment, noticing again how composed she was, how unaffected she appeared, and he wondered if that was real or simply another version of control he had never learned to recognize. You are leaving early, he said. Not as a question, but not quite a statement either. Chloe nodded. Yes, I have plans. The words were simple, but they landed with weight, because they no longer revolved around him. Adrian walked toward his desk, glancing at the schedule she placed in front of him. Everything was in order, as always, every detail accounted for, every transition seamless, and yet there was a quiet finality to it that he could not ignore. You have been doing this for a long time, he said, his voice softer now, less directive. Chloe gave a small nod. 5 years. Adrian let that number settle. Longer than most of his executives, longer than many partnerships that had come and gone, and he realized that time alone did not guarantee permanence, not when attention had been missing from the equation. Why did you stay? He asked, the question coming from a place he did not fully understand yet. Chloe hesitated for just a second, not because she did not have an answer, but because she was choosing how much of it to give. I believed in what we were building, she said finally, and for a moment, Adrian thought that was all she would say, but then she added quietly, "And I believed in you." The admission hung in the air, heavier than anything else spoken that night. Adrian's expression shifted, subtle but real, because that belief had been given freely, without demand, without expectation, and he had accepted it without ever acknowledging its weight. Chloe straightened slightly, her tone returning to neutral. "Everything you need for tomorrow is there. If anything changes, you can call me." Adrian looked at her then, really looked, as if trying to understand something he should have understood years ago. "Will you answer?" he asked before he could stop himself. Chloe paused at the door, her hand resting lightly on the handle, and for a moment, the answer seemed uncertain, not because she did not know it, but because it was no longer automatic. "I will see," she said softly, not unkind, not distant, just honest, and with that, she opened the door and stepped out, leaving Adrian standing in a room that had never felt empty before until now. The next morning arrived with a kind of clarity that Adrian had not asked for, the kind that stripped away distractions and left only what mattered, and for the first time in years, his office did not feel like a place of control, it felt like a place of questions, the sunlight cutting across the floor exactly as it always did, the city moving outside his window with the same relentless rhythm. But something inside him had shifted. Something he could no longer ignore or push aside with another meeting or another deal. Chloe's absence was not immediate, not obvious to anyone else, but to him, it was precise, exact, measurable in the smallest details. There was no coffee waiting at 8 o'clock, no perfectly aligned schedule printed and placed at the corner of his desk, no quiet presence already anticipating his needs before he even articulated them. Instead, there was a digital notification on his screen. A simple update sent at 7:45, efficient, minimal, distant, and that distance felt intentional. Adrian stood there for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the empty space where she usually stood, and it was not the inconvenience that unsettled him, it was the realization that for 5 years, he had never truly seen the effort behind what had always appeared effortless. And now that it was gone, the absence was louder than any mistake could have been. He sat down slowly, opening the schedule she had sent. Every detail was still there, every meeting, every transition, every contingency accounted for, because Chloe Bennett did not do things halfway. Even when she was stepping away, she still ensured everything worked, and that consistency only made this shift more undeniable. Around 9:15, there was a knock at his door, softer than usual, less certain. "Come in," Adrian said, his voice steady, but quieter than normal. The door opened, but it was not Chloe, it was one of the junior assistants, her posture slightly tense as she stepped inside. "Good morning, Mr. Vale," she said carefully. "I am covering for Chloe today." Covering, the word settled in his mind with more weight than it should have. Adrian nodded once, maintaining composure. "Understood," he replied, scanning the documents she handed him. But there was a slight delay in his responses now, a fraction of hesitation that had never been there before. The assistant continued, her voice polite but uncertain. "She mentioned she might be taking some time off next week, just to let you know." Adrian's hand paused for a brief second before he set the papers down. Time off. Chloe rarely took time off, not because she could not, but because she chose not to, because she had always prioritized the work, prioritized him, and now she was choosing differently. And that choice carried more meaning than any formal resignation ever could. "I see," he said simply, dismissing the assistant with a nod, and once the door closed, the silence returned, heavier now, more defined. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting to the glass wall, but he was not seeing the city this time, he was seeing moments, small, precise, unavoidable. Chloe standing by his desk late at night, waiting without complaint. Chloe adjusting a schedule to make space for something he had forgotten. Chloe pausing, just once, as if she wanted to say something more, and him, already moving on to the next task, the next priority, the next decision. He had not ignored her intentionally. That was the part that unsettled him the most. It had been effortless, unconscious, a pattern built over time that he had never questioned, because it had never affected his outcomes. Until now. Adrian stood abruptly, the motion sharper than necessary, his hand brushing against the edge of his desk as he reached for his jacket, because for the first time, this was not about business, This was not about efficiency or results. This was about something he did not fully understand yet, but knew he could not afford to lose without at least trying to understand it. And as he stepped out of his office, one thought remained clear, steady, and impossible to ignore. If she had chosen to step away, then for the first time, he would have to choose to follow. Adrian did not announce where he was going, he did not delegate, did not inform the board, did not check his calendar for conflicts, because for the first time, none of that felt relevant. Instead, he moved with a quiet urgency that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with something far less structured, something uncertain, something human. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. Each passing floor marked not by numbers but by thoughts he could no longer suppress. Every moment Chloe had been there, consistent, patient, present, and every moment he had treated that presence as guaranteed, as fixed, as something that would remain no matter how little attention he gave it. And now that assumption had been removed, and in its place was something far more fragile, something that required effort, intention, and the willingness to admit he had been wrong. When the doors opened, the city air met him with a sharp clarity, cool and immediate, grounding him in a way the office never had. He stepped onto the sidewalk without hesitation, pulling his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over her name for a brief second before pressing call. The line rang once, twice, and then went to voicemail, a simple automated voice replacing what he had expected without realizing it. Adrian exhaled slowly, lowering the phone. Of course she did not answer. She had said she would see. And for the first time, that answer had weight. It was not automatic, not guaranteed. It was a choice, and that choice was no longer his to influence from a distance. He looked around the city, the movement, the noise, the constant flow of people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going, and for a moment, Adrian Vale stood still, not because he did not know where to go, but because he was realizing that knowing where was not the same as understanding why. Chloe had always been there, within reach, within structure, within a system he controlled, but outside of that system she had her own life, her own spaces, her own rhythm, and he had never once tried to enter it, because he had never needed to, until now, and that realization shifted something deeper than urgency. It shifted his approach. He could not simply call her back into his world, he would have to step into hers, even if it meant standing in a place where he did not have control. Adrian lowered his phone, thinking, not in strategies, not in outcomes, but in moments, small, precise, real, and one memory surfaced with unexpected clarity, a conversation he had barely registered months ago, Chloe mentioning a bookstore on the west side, a quiet place she went to when she needed to think. He had not asked where, had not followed up, had not cared enough to remember until now, but something about the way she had said it, the slight pause, the softness in her voice, had stayed somewhere beneath the surface, and now it rose, steady and clear. Adrian turned without hesitation, signaling for a car, giving the driver an approximate location rather than a precise address, because that was all he had, and for once, it was enough. The ride across the city felt different from any he had taken before, not measured in time or efficiency, but in awareness, every second pulling him closer to a place where he might not be welcomed, where he might not have a role, where he might simply be a man trying to understand something he should have understood long ago. When the car slowed near a quiet street lined with small storefronts and warm lights spilling onto the sidewalk, Adrian stepped out, his gaze scanning the area, and then he saw it, a narrow bookstore with soft yellow light glowing through the windows, the kind of place that did not demand attention, but offered it quietly to those who stepped inside. He paused for a moment at the door, his reflection faint in the glass. No longer the composed figure of control he had always been, but something less certain, more real, and as his hand reached for the handle, one thought settled in with quiet clarity. This was not about getting her back, this was about finally seeing her, and whether or not she chose to let him stay would no longer be something he could decide for her. The small bell above the bookstore door chimed softly as Adrian stepped inside, the sound gentle but unmistakable, marking his entrance into a space that felt entirely different from anything he was used to. The air carried the faint scent of paper and coffee, warm and quiet, a contrast to the sharp precision of glass and steel he had built his world around, and for a moment, he simply stood there, letting his eyes adjust. Not searching with urgency this time, but observing, noticing. Understanding. Shelves lined the walls, filled with stories he had never taken the time to read, chairs tucked into corners where people sat alone but not lonely. And then he saw her. Chloe stood near the back, flipping through a book, her posture relaxed, her expression calm in a way he had never seen inside the office. She was not managing anything here, not organizing, not anticipating, just existing. And the simplicity of that moment held more weight than any boardroom decision he had ever made. Adrian took a step forward, slower now, deliberate, as if rushing would break something fragile. Chloe looked up before he reached her, her eyes meeting his with a quiet recognition that held no surprise, as if part of her had expected this, or at least was not entirely unprepared for it. "Adrian," she said, her voice soft, steady, not distant, but not welcoming either, "just present. You found it." Adrian nodded slightly, his gaze steady but unguarded in a way that would have been impossible. "Just days ago, you mentioned it once," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Chloe closed the book gently, placing it back on the shelf. "I did not think you were listening." Adrian let out a small breath, almost a quiet acknowledgement of truth. "I was not," he admitted, and the honesty landed between them without defense, without justification, just fact. Chloe studied him for a moment, not with skepticism, but with curiosity, like she was seeing something unfamiliar in someone she thought she understood completely. "Why are you here?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question. Adrian paused, not because he did not have an answer, but because he was choosing to give the right one, not the easy one. "Because I realized something," he said slowly, his words measured but real. "I built everything around me to work perfectly, but I never stopped to understand the people who made it possible." Chloe's expression softened slightly, but she did not step closer, she did not fill the space, she let it remain, open, intentional. "And you think that changes now?" she asked quietly. Adrian shook his head just once, not in denial, but in humility. "I do not know if it changes anything for you," he said, "but it changes everything for me." The words were not dramatic, not rehearsed, but they carried a weight that could not be ignored. Chloe looked down briefly, her fingers brushing the edge of the shelf beside her, a small, grounding gesture, before she looked back at him. "Daniel is a good man," she said again, not as a warning, but as a truth she was standing on. Adrian nodded, his expression steady. "I believe you," he replied, and this time, there was no tension behind it, no resistance, just acceptance. And that acceptance shifted something, not in the room, but in the space between them, because for the first time, Adrian was not trying to control the outcome. He was simply standing in the moment, present, aware, and willing to let her decide what came next. Chloe held his gaze a second longer, searching for something, not perfection, not certainty, but sincerity. And whatever she found there made her exhale slowly, not in relief, but in recognition. "You are late," she said softly, the words carrying more than just time. Adrian nodded once, a small, quiet acknowledgement. "I know," he said, and there was no excuse that followed, no explanation, just acceptance of what that meant. Chloe glanced toward the window, the fading light casting soft shadows across the room, before looking back